and at transfer stations manage a lot more material that the city generates beyond single family. But when we think about kind of rolling out a curbside composting program or enacting a lot of policies that impacts the residential side, we really are only hitting a pretty small portion of the waste stream as a whole. We can see here kind of just a rough comparison in terms of the total tonnage that's generated annually in DC. Single family is just about 10%. Using really round numbers, single family is about 10%, multifamily is about 12%, and business makes up 78%, just about. So it's a huge portion of the waste stream beyond what DPW itself and the DC government collects on their own. And it's managed in kind of two distinct pathways. The residential pathway that DC government and Department of Public Works picks up, as well as the commercial side of things that manages that 90% of the waste that's generated in the multifamily sector and in the commercial sector. As y'all may know, the DC government has two publicly owned and operated transfer stations. And transfer stations is a jargony word for where everything comes to be put on bigger trucks to go to a processing facility. So trash goes there, recycling goes there. DC has drop-offs at any given time one of its two transfer stations for some additional materials like bulk and electronics and household hazardous waste. And those facilities are really key to managing our waste stream well. It's where all the recycling comes for us to send to a recycling facility or to a MRF. And the acronym is MRF. It's pronounced Smurf, but without the S. My very first job in sustainable packaging, I knew a lot about sustainability, I thought, but I had never heard that acronym before. And it was maybe 2 weeks before I figured out what it meant. So if you are ever listening to recycling conversations, taking place from recycling conversations, that's a really helpful acronym to know. MRFs, recycling facilities, are where the actual sorting happens. And then it goes to a third destination to actually be processed, if not a secondary sorting facility from there. So residential and commercial material is collected separately, but comes together at transfer stations. That is often managed by DPW. Commercial material doesn't have to go to DPW's transfer stations in Washington, DC, but most of it does in practice. Private haulers are welcome to take it anywhere, but as it turns out, having two facilities located in DC tends to be the shortest distance to truck material, so it's often the best place for them to bring it. We also have pretty low rates compared to a lot of other places in the region. And then what happens at the transfer station is a preliminary screening. As you guys know, recycling is not always as clean and high quality as we might want it to be. And unfortunately, recycling facilities and MRFs can't process highly contaminated material. We have the unfortunate reality that there's a threshold where recycling is just too contaminated for the recycling system to handle. And rewinding to 2 years ago was when we really started experimenting with screening and a preliminary screen to take place of recycling that's being brought into DPW transfer stations. So that's 100% of residential recycling and all the commercial recycling that's brought to DPW, the majority of it that's generated in the city. And if it comes in above a certain threshold, it's going to be reallocated to trash because it's too contaminated for the recycling facility to handle. Depending on the facility, that threshold might be 15% contaminated, it might be 20% contaminated, it might be 30% contaminated. Our facilities that we contract with in DC have about a 20% threshold of contamination that they can deal with. Not all contamination is the same though. Some is a lot worse than others. And generally speaking, loads are really pretty clean or really pretty dirty. It's rare that you get loads that are kind of on the edge. It's not super common. You typically will get something that is super food soiled and wet from a restaurant that can't be recycled, or something that is 100% all in plastic bags and can't be recycled. It's rare that you get things that are really marginal and on the edge, but it's helpful to keep that kind of threshold in mind as we think about the quality of recycling that's being collected and how we could improve it overall. Once residential material gets to a recycling facility, we in DC contract with two. The primary contract is with Waste Management's recycling facility in Elkridge, Maryland. And then they also subcontract to Republic's MRF recycling facility in Manassas, Virginia. It's about a 50-50 split of where material goes. Both are really pretty well managed, efficient systems. They service a lot of communities in the DC region, not just us. So a huge amount of tonnage from many, many communities in Maryland and Virginia as a whole. And they have a really efficient system. 98% of recyclable material gets sorted and makes its way into the commodity market to be recycled. There's a 2% process loss that takes place at the facility where, stuff is inadvertently misdirected to the wrong stream and then has to get pulled out, or kind of doesn't successfully make its way through the sorting process. That's not to say there isn't contamination that's being sorted out, because if you put a set of sneakers into a recycling facility, that's not going to make it to a paper bale or a plastic bale or a metal bale or a glass bale to get recycled. And one of the questions that came up in the chat towards the beginning was about glass and metal in particular. So I'd love to talk a little bit about kind of the specific material streams and how we manage them. But just to give a little context in terms of how much material we're directing into the recycling stream for residential as well as citywide diversion, it's helpful to keep in mind that about 1 in 4 pounds that we generate in the single family stream is diverted. That's our diversion rate of what gets put into blue bins. It does include the portion of contamination that exists. Typically how cities measure waste data in terms of recycling. That's not to say that, I'll step back to give a little context into how good or bad of a number that is. That basically puts us in the middle of the pack. We certainly aren't a San Francisco or a Seattle or a Portland with a really impressive waste diversion rate of 40, 50, 60%, which you see across communities in Canada and Europe, as well as some industrializing nations too. But we aren't a New York that has a 13% or a Chicago that has a single-digit percentage point waste diversion number. So we certainly have obviously a huge amount of room to grow, but we're kind of in the middle of the pack in terms of what big cities see in their waste diversion. On the citywide side, though, it is much lower. It's 16%. And when thinking about the ratio of how much single family material to how much multifamily and business waste is generated, it starts to make sense in that a lot of commercial material comes in more contaminated than single family material. So as a whole, we are less successful at getting businesses and multifamily residents to put things into the blue bin in the first place. And what does get put into the blue bin has a higher contamination rate than single family. So when we're thinking about where we want citywide diversion to go, we know that 25% has been the rate that we've been able to achieve in the single family space, and both should be able to well exceed that with effective policies and enforcement and education. Talking a little bit about the material side of things, though, we have really strong end markets for almost all the materials that we manage in DC. The reason that we generate a universal recycling list in DC that all single family, multifamily, and businesses have to abide by is that we want a single list that's been vetted across all the facilities in the region and what they can accept and process. So it's based off of what all of the region can accommodate and what there's a market for. So we aren't crafting a list of this is what we'd like to recycle and we'd really like to try and find places that will take it. We figure out what the market wants and what there's demand for, and then that's what we craft the universal recycling list that DC has around it. The one exception is glass, though, so I'll start there. Unfortunately, glass is a really challenging material to recycle due to its weight. Over the course of the past 10, 15 years, it's the material that's dropped off of recycling lists nationwide the fastest, or shifted from being genuinely recycled back into glass containers to being used as what we call alternative daily cover or aggregate in road construction. There's a lot of kind of intermediary industrial uses for glass, but we have two main challenges with recycling glass in DC, and we're certainly not alone there, but we certainly suffer from it. There is no glass manufacturer closer than North Carolina and New Jersey. So we're talking about pretty big distances that we have to haul glass to recycle it. And the second big challenge is that glass collected in curbside systems that all go to a recycling facility that manages single stream mixed collection is that unfortunately all the small contaminants that get put into the recycling system contaminate the glass. So when we talk about a 2-inch by 2-inch threshold for how big of an item needs to be to recycle it in the curbside system, the reason why is because anything smaller will contaminate the glass stream. So we're talking about shredded paper, keys, coins, you name it. Lots of folks ask questions on Twitter and elsewhere about, how can I manage this bottle cap or this lip balm container or what have you. And unfortunately, those items are too small to be sorted in a recycling facility. And the recycling facility is designed to think that anything small that's being introduced to it is glass, because glass breaks in the recycling process, getting knocked around, picked up by trucks and dumped onto a conveyor belt. So unfortunately, if you go to a MRF today that is a single stream system and you look at the glass that's collected, you really couldn't tell it's glass. I wish I had photos that were publicly approved to share. It is chock full of bits of paper and plastic film. It's really hard to tell what it is. So because it's so contaminated and low quality, even if we had a glass manufacturer in our backyard, it wouldn't be high enough quality for us to bring it to a glass manufacturer to put back into glass containers. So today, any glass that's collected in DC's single stream system does get directed to alternative daily cover. Folks may be familiar with a lot of movement that Alexandria and Arlington and folks in Northern Virginia have taken to provide better pathways for glass. And that has been super exciting to see progress on. They're now a few years into that program, and they have dozens of locations throughout Northern Virginia where folks can bring glass in a source separated way. So drop-offs just for glass containers for nothing else. And by collecting them in a dedicated single stream fashion, it's high quality enough. They have almost next to no contamination. It's really, really impressive numbers in terms of quality. And they're able to long haul it, to truck it down to North Carolina to our nearest glass manufacturer to genuinely recycle back into glass containers. And knowing that is a far hike, we've run those carbon calculations, and because glass is such an energy intensive material, you have to heat it up to 16, 17, 1800 degrees Fahrenheit to melt back down. The carbon calculation is still net positive when you think about the fuel cost of hauling all of that material to North Carolina. So that is by far the material that we have the biggest challenge with in terms of managing and directing to higher and better uses. Doesn't have to go back into glass containers though. Glass can be used in fiberglass applications for building products. Certainly there are those kind of intermediary steps of using it for aggregate or sand for flood risk and other kind of natural disaster management strategies. But it's a really challenging material to solve without that dedicated collection. So we are seeing that some private haulers are starting to say, we don't want to take it. Used to get a lot of multifamily residents saying, oh no, what's happened? My hauler says we can't take it anymore. It still is on the universal recycling list for DC. So everyone is still required to recycle it, but the end market is a challenge. So even if one's hauler says they can't recycle it anymore, the entity, the business or the multifamily building is still responsible for providing a recycling solution for glass, even if it does have to be a dedicated glass collection like Alexandria and Arlington have for, big dumpsters worth at their drop-off containers. And a really good question in the chat, Maura, about bottle deposit and return and how that could impact this. Beverage companies definitely lobby against extended producer responsibility of any kind. Bottle deposits are a type of extended producer responsibility that have been working really well in a lot of states in the US for quite some time. And it has a really proven track record. You can get 80% of beverage containers collected if it's in a bottle deposit program where you have to pay 5-10 cents when you buy a bottle, and then you get it back when you bring it back to a collection point. One of the really tricky things about bottle deposits, though, in the DC area is that we know we have such a huge commuter population, and there's a lot of concern about folks bringing in bottles from Maryland and Virginia and redeeming them in DC. So I swear, like every 12 to 18 months, this idea gets tossed into the fray in the political sphere in DC, and the same conversation happens where DC wants to do it. Maryland is pretty game. They've had some really progressive waste management policies starting to evolve in the past couple of years. And Virginia, unfortunately, has preemption in their state where the state has to pass that law. Local jurisdictions can't do that. So until you have a joint Maryland, Virginia, DC agreement to have a bottle deposit system, I don't think that it's in the cards. I wish it were, and maybe there's a way to do it that can circumvent that policy, but there's a lot of concern about folks, about it being a net cost beyond what it should be because so many folks are bringing in bottles from outside of the city, which is a weird, funky challenge of being in the geographic situation we are. Not many people have to reckon with that kind of issue like us. Just to look at another bottle related question here about whether we accept plastic bottles from cleanup events, if not very clean. Unfortunately, recyclables do have to be clean and dry to be recycled. So if a plastic bottle is caked over with dirt after being in a park for a while, it is amazing that a team had gone through to pick it up and ensure that it's not turning into microplastics in the environment, but it doesn't, unfortunately, make it fit for recycling. One of the other big challenges with bottles or packaging from cleanup events and ocean plastics as well is that it's been exposed to really harsh elements. So polyethylene terephthalate, or PET, which has a #1 resin identification code, is a really strong, really high value plastic in the recycling stream. But once it's been exposed to sunlight and water and wind, it really weakens. So the technical recyclability of it diminishes a lot once it's been exposed to the elements, especially salt water. So one could totally clean bottles from an event, but it would probably be pretty challenging to do so. There's some great data from nonprofits that support ocean plastic cleanup that looks at what the pathways are to do with those items. A lot of those rigid plastics, aluminum bottles, glass bottles, can be recycled once they're collected if clean enough. But the most important thing is to get it out of the environment and to make sure it's not exposing, harmful substances into our waterways and to where wildlife would come into contact with it. Yeah, an unfortunate reality there. But thinking about some of the other materials that we handle, just to kind of walk through the full suite, we have really strong markets for aluminum, for steel, for paper of all kinds, both kind of, cardboard as well as mixed paper, office paper, newspaper, cartons as well. We are one of the 62% of American communities that can recycle them. Cartons are really complex constructs of plastic, aluminum, and paper, and they require dedicated facilities to manage. So you toss one into your blue bin, they're going to get sorted as a carton into its own special stream, and then go to one of the very few facilities in the US that can process them. And unfortunately, because they are such a complex structure of paper, plastic, aluminum, they really have to go to pretty low grade end uses once they're recycled. They're not typically recycled back into another container. Still a really important thing to be keeping it out of landfill and going back into new products. I don't know if I personally find myself fixating on downcycling and upcycling quite so much, because I think at the end of the day, we don't yet do such a great job recycling materials as a whole, that once we get everything out of landfill and waste to energy, I think it's important to think through what's higher and better use. But until we're getting the majority of stuff out of the stream into the recycling system, I don't think it makes quite so much sense to think through. For paper, I had a couple questions about tissue paper. Thanks, Sarah, for adding that one. Tissue paper can't be recycled, unfortunately, in curbside systems, generally speaking. It's unfortunately just not a hard, flat, stiff surface. So the way that paper is sorted at MRFs is that they float up a big tumbler, a big rotating piece of machinery with hooks, and it's called a star screen. It basically surfs and floats up paper items, and then it gets sorted between cardboard and paper and newspaper, all of the different bales that paper is recycled into. Depending on, there's a lot of mixed data about how tissue paper sorts. Some studies show that it sorts fine enough where it can get over that piece of machinery and into the paper stream. To be honest, I have not really seen that work in practice. I compost everything that I can as well as recycle. So because I'm also composting material, if I'm a little dubious about how it will perform in the paper stream, I'm going to compost the tissue paper. Because if it's, just a plain piece of tissue paper that's stuffed into a pair of sneakers when you order them online, that's not going to have any funky inks or dyes or additives that might compromise its compostability. But you may see like pieces of toilet paper rolls that are wrapped in a tissue paper that have how to recycle label on it saying it's recyclable. And it's a really fuzzy line because some tissue is so thin that it's transparent and diaphanous, and it's so little fiber that it's really going to have a hard time performing. Others are just thick enough that they're a little bit more like paper than a tissue, where they might just sort well enough, statistically speaking, to give it the edge in the sorting system. So it is a really hard, fine line to draw. It's definitely a big challenge. For paper that's been balled up, we definitely recommend all paper across the board, best to have it flat. Cardboard boxes should be broken down flat. Cereal boxes are pretty flat in and of themselves. You probably don't have to knock them down anymore, but paper for sure flattened is most ideal. So it can get up that piece of equipment, since recycling facilities are designed to think that any 2D item is paper. For that reason, we always want to put lids of containers back on the container it came in. So I had a tub of cream cheese that I finished earlier today that I wish I hadn't already taken out in the recycling, and its plastic lid is pretty flat. If I toss that into the blue bin alone, it would be at risk to missort into the paper stream because it's flat, and recycling facilities are designed to think that flat things are paper. So we always want to put it back onto the container to be 3D, since recycling facilities are designed to think that 3D containers are plastic or metal or glass and will get further sorted through optical sorters down in the process. On the plastic side of the equation, we have really strong end markets for almost every kind of plastic that we accept in DC. Most folks are familiar with the kind of quote unquote recycling numbers. I totally encourage you to not call them recycling numbers. It is a little bit counterintuitive. For eons, communities have been using them as a shorthand because we don't have very good ways about talking about plastic in the waste management stream besides these numbers. But the short and long of it is that they are resin identification codes, and they were developed in the 80s and 90s to basically, at a business to business level, tell you what the base material of the plastic is made of. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's recyclable. In fact, several kinds of plastic are never recyclable curbside in any community in the US, or I would hearken to guess the globe. For instance, number 3 is PVC. PVC is not a plastic that any curbside program can recycle. Number 7 is a catch-all category. So everything that is 1 through 6 is a particular kind of plastic, like number 1 PET is polyethylene terephthalate. Number 7 is actually a catch-all category for everything else. Everything that's not 1 through 6. So number 7 item can be a compostable plastic, like a PLA that we see if we get a compostable cold cup getting iced coffee, that's what it comes in. Or it can be a acrylic CD case that isn't recyclable, has to go into the trash. So we always want to be really cautious about those recycling numbers. But we do have really strong markets for number 1 PET, for number 2 HDPE, for high density polyethylene, that's something like a milk jug, as well as number 4 LDPE, low density polyethylene, that's something like your takeout deli container, if you get takeout. Number 5 polypropylene is something like a yogurt cup. I saw a question up there earlier about how clean they need to be. The answer is pretty clean. We always want to remove, all food has to be removed from any recyclable to recycle. I generally am using a dish scrubber with just water. If it's something super funky and I'm feeling committed to the effort, which is most days, I'll take some soap if it's like peanut butter and it's being a real pain to get out. But suffice it to say that if you've scraped all the peanut butter out from the jar, but there's still residue and you just don't feel like cleaning it out, I don't blame you, but also it should go into the trash, not into the recycling stream. So wouldn't fault anyone for drawing a line at somewhere in the sand, but it does need to be pretty clean to be recycled. The last kind of plastic that we accept in the recycling stream in DC is number 6 polystyrene, and we only accept rigid polystyrene. That's something that a lot of takeout containers will be, or lids for coffee cups. But polystyrene is the one exception where it is very low value in the end market. So we have really high prices that we're able to get for PET, for HDPE, for LDPE, for polypropylene. Polystyrene is very low value. It's very brittle, so it's harder to deal with in the recycling stream. It's harder to just melt down and create a new product with. And as you guys might know, DC is one of the very first places to ban foam polystyrene. So we don't have a whole lot of it. I love it, Karen, the dishwashing of the peanut butter container. That's some commitment right there. So we don't see a lot of foam packaging around, but that's a great example of why resin identification codes, or RIC codes for short, aren't tantamount to recycling numbers, because a foam big soda cup that you might get at a 7-Eleven on a road trip is a number 6 container. So is a rigid coffee lid, but we only accept the rigid coffee lid in DC. We don't accept a number 6 container, even if it's number 6, if it's foam and blown up. Another really great example of why those numbers don't tell us as much as we might want them to is when we think about film and rigid plastic versus plastic bags and film. So takeout bag is going to be, a number 4 plastic, typically low density polyethylene. That's a really high value plastic, but we can't accept any plastic film in the recycling stream because it clogs that first piece of equipment we talked about for paper to go up. That big tumbler with hooks, plastic bags jam it, and it causes recycling facilities to have to shut down multiple times a day for workers to physically go into the machinery and use box cutters to cut out the plastic bags. There's been a lot of innovation in the industry to try and figure out ways to prevent that from being as big of an issue. Bigger tumblers, so bags have a harder time wrapping around them. And that's helped somewhat. Between that and getting our contamination rate down in DC, we've stopped needing to shut down our facilities 5-6 times a day. And now it's only more like 2-3 times a day. So when we have to shut down the facility, everything has to stop, and it adds cost and time to the process. We can't recycle as much material in a given day. The kind of tonnage per hour ratio goes down. But it's definitely a big challenge. So a number 4 item, number 4 is a high value recyclable plastic, but only when it's in a rigid deli container format, not when it's in a plastic bag that would have to be brought to a store drop off. A great question about whether grocery stores really recycle the plastic bags, or is it a PR scam? I have seen the back end of many grocery stores, plastic bag and film recycling operations, and have seen plastic film recycling facilities take it and create plastic products from it. So can testify that those systems work really well. I'm sure that there is the errant grocery store out there that has a couple bins out because they think it'll give them some green cred. I imagine that that's probably the case, that there's a couple bad actors in the system, but definitely can testify to seeing tons and tons of plastic film be recycled. And we are actually really lucky in the DC area. The nation's biggest plastic film recycler is in Winchester, Virginia. So unlike a lot of places around the country that have to ship it really far to get it recycled, we really don't. It's just in the next state over. Thanks, Stephanie, for that question. Any reason why DC would not also accept plastic film and sell to companies? It's a great question. Plastic film is a revenue generator. So one of the reasons when people are concerned about where plastic film goes at a grocery store, it's a really valid concern. We obviously always want to be really critical of what's going on and making sure that everything is above board, but plastic film is a huge revenue generator. So a lot of bigger companies set up plastic film recycling programs solely because they make revenue from it. They could give a crap about the environmental benefit of recycling, but especially when you earn money for it when you collect it, and you earn 3 times as much when you compact it down and bale it and then recycle it. So people can make money from it just collecting it in their store, but they can earn 2-3 times as much when they invest in a baler and pack it down as well. It's a great question as to why DC doesn't collect that in its transfer station. We have 2 transfer stations, as we talked a little bit about, one at Fort Totten and one at Benning Road. And the big challenge with our transfer stations is that they are really old and they are not big enough to accommodate the material that they need to be accommodating. Many folks may be aware of a crippling fire that Benning Road transfer station suffered last July, and it unfortunately took the facility entirely out of commission. It's a really debilitating fire. It went on for 2 days plus 2-engine fire with, I don't know, I'm forgetting the exact numbers, like 80-90 firefighters were responding. It was a really critical situation. And battery fires are really common in the recycling system, not only for batteries, which are the biggest concern, but if you recycle an empty hand sanitizer container, that's alcohol. That's something that can be ignited. If people put electronics in the recycling system or in their normal household trash, that's a fire hazard. And as temperatures continue to increase with climate change, we unfortunately will be having more and more ripe conditions for combustion in the trash and recycling stream. So when Benning Road burned down, originally we had 2 facilities, both were old, needed a lot of help. Now we only have 1 and still needs a lot of help. We were lucky that because Benning Road was such an old facility, council allocated about $8 million to begin a design process to demo and rebuild a new modern transfer station. So I think you're exactly right, Stephanie. I think that's a really logical material for DPW to collect. And in all likelihood, I think they might in that new facility that they design. It's going to be a few years, hopefully not more than a few years until that is, hitting the road and reopened to the public. And it's a great point. It's a revenue generator. And for that reason, it should also collect glass in a dedicated way and cardboard in a dedicated way. Even if it's not from the residential stream, there's so much of that material in the commercial side. You can always earn money for a material to a greater degree if you collect it in a dedicated, distinct way. So simply put, when we were thinking about what materials we can collect at the transfer stations, we're looking at a bird's eye plan and figuring out the truck turning radius and how many different streams could be dropped off. And the new facility should hopefully be able to accommodate a lot more of those streams, as well as organics. There have been a few really great questions I've seen come in on the composting and organic side, but one of the reasons that it's been hard for DC to develop a commercial composting program or a residential curbside composting program is that we really don't have a space in our current facilities to bring food waste and drop it off. We know that, of course, theoretically, if we start a composting program, if you have 20 tons of food waste in the trash and you now have 20 tons of food waste in the organic stream, you'll have less material to manage on the trash side. But in terms of the square footage of what you need, if you have a 5-story trash pile, starting a composting program, you might have a 4-story trash pile, but you still have a 4-story trash pile. So we really need more space and dedicated, with proper drainage space to manage organics, since it's such a liquidy kind of waste. But we do benefit. Not every city has such rich composting infrastructure like DC does. We are really lucky to have a number of composters in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, including Prince George's County in Maryland that has the biggest composting facility on the East Coast. Very much hoping to get a tour of that setup for folks who might be interested in the near future. It's a phenomenal facility and it has a huge amount of room to expand. So not only do we have a diversity of composters in the area, but we have a really big one that can take all of the food waste we give it. Not every city is like that. There's a lot of cities that genuinely don't have a place to bring organic waste if they wanted to start a composting program. So we do have a lot of places to send it, but the tough piece for us is that midway point. When we have small trucks going around the street, we really need a place to aggregate that, to put it on bigger trucks to haul to that last facility. At this point, because Benning Road is out of commission and we only have 1 transfer station, to think about starting a composting in the next couple of years, we might need to forgo that idea. And maybe we don't have that midway point to put it on bigger trucks, and maybe we haul it directly to the composting facility. That adds cost if you have 10 small trucks moving the same material that you could have 5 big trucks taking. But with the constraints that we have in the system, that might just be the most logical approach for us to think about. And I know, Emily, that we're at 6:43, and I know this was about the time that we were thinking we'd firmly pivot to questions. I know we have a lot of questions to go through. Maybe I can answer that one that just came in on the composting side, knowing we were talking about it, but otherwise, Emily, would love your thoughts on which questions we should pivot to next.
Sure, sounds good.
For that one, Amy, it's a great question. Compost collected at the farmers market. So Office of Waste Diversion at DC government manages the DC Zero Waste Farmers Market drop-off program that has about a dozen locations now. I think it's increased from 10 when I left to 12, if I'm not mistaken. They are managed by a really phenomenal vendor that services the city and lots of businesses and multifamily buildings. The majority of it goes to that very big facility at PG County. A small portion goes to urban farms and composting operations in DC proper. Basically, when the program first started 4 or 5 years ago at this point, that's where 100% of it went. And the program has grown so exponentially that there's no longer urban farms and community gardens in DC that can accommodate the amount of food waste that's being brought. So when the program started, they thought about what's the kind of organics that we can manage at small 3-bin systems at community scale operations. So that's mostly vegetable scraps, coffee filters, coffee grounds, eggshells, cut flowers, that kind of thing, not the more complex compostable packaging and meat and dairy. Now we're at a point a few years later in the program where we do send some stuff to small operations, which is great. We want to keep it local where we can and rebuild DC soils and contribute to urban farms, but we're generating so much of it and collecting so much of it that it has to go to a big facility. And that big facility can accept meat and dairy and compostable packaging, no problem. So I think to me, at some point, we're going to want to shift from that more restricted list of items to that more robust suite, because it's going to go to a big facility anyway. But there are, I should add the asterisk that there are a few farmers market compost drop-off programs that are independently managed by some farmers markets. DC does foot the bill and pay the cost for a lot of those programs, but not all of them. So there's a chance that some might go to some other operations in the DC area, but by and large, they all go to PG County's composting facility. I'll stop there, Emily, on that one.
So you've done an excellent job of keeping up with the questions as you're going. There's some that are kind of maybe larger, broader in topic that I wanted to pull out. So Karen asked the question, how can we meaningfully get DC residents to stop putting their recycling in plastic bags?
Such a good question. The most important question from my perspective. Sure, we want more people to recycle and to recycle more material, but if it's going into a plastic bag, we are cutting ourselves off at the knees. DC has been really focused on plastic bag contamination in recent years. Just a quick note in terms of how much so. In 2017, we had a 27% contamination rate in our single family residential recycling. That's bad. It's not the worst out there. Baltimore is worse, for instance. They've got they're rocking like a 50% contamination rate. They got a lot of challenges there. But we had a 27% one, which is nothing to run home about. And by focusing solely on plastic bags in mailers that go out to single family households, in public metro bus stop advertising, and in a cart tagging program, where we literally go out at 4 a.m. ahead of the recycling trucks and look into bins, see if it's contaminated, and we give people feedback on a sticker if it is, to tell them exactly what they did wrong. 9 times out of 10, it's putting stuff into a plastic bag. We've been able to work that contamination rate down to 11% in single family, which is really good. There are very few cities that have cleaner recycling than we do now. So when we had a 27% contamination rate, it's a little bit counterintuitive to try and invest a lot in people to recycle more, because it's coming in at a high enough contamination rate above our 20% threshold regularly enough where we can't really do a whole lot with it. But now we have clean enough material that we can really double down on volume. Cart tagging is an awesome program. There is not currently a volunteer opportunity to do it through the district. It was hard enough to get temporary workers who we were employed to show up at 4:30 in the morning on rainy, cold days. So there was never an interest in trying to get volunteers to join, but I think it would be an amazing idea. And I would love to reach out. I see some familiar names and faces from Twitter and Instagram and elsewhere. If we are not already connected and you are interested in doing that, I'd be delighted to connect you with the office so they can keep you in mind for the next time they do a pilot. It typically has taken place once or twice a year. Depending on the funding. It's an expensive program to run, and DC has not yet worked it into the normal processes, but it's been made possible by dedicated grant funding from a group called the Recycling Partnership that funds cart tagging efforts nationwide. So a really great question there, but I think more education. We only spend $2 a household, which is considered decent recycling education for single family. We invest pennies on the dollar to multifamily. So I think simply a lot of people just don't know. I wish I had a better surefire silver bullet, but I think it's hammering away at the same tried and true strategies, most likely.
I think you're building an army, so it's good.
The more the
Um,
merrier.
Amanda had the question, how do you personally consider environmental trade-offs such as recycling, carbon footprint, transportation when making purchasing decisions in different packaging?
This is such a good one. And I love that reasonable minds could differ. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. It's all I used to do when I worked in packaging and helped companies think through these same things. They would say, should we opt for the lowest carbon package or should we opt for the most recyclable package? What should we do? It's rare that one hits all of those bullets. When we think in broad strokes, metal, paper, and high value plastic, we have really strong end markets for. In terms of carbon, glass and metal have very high carbon footprints because of the energy needs to melt them down. You have to heat them up to almost 2000 degrees to melt them down. So they tend to have much higher carbon footprints. Paper and plastic have very low carbon footprints. So generally speaking, paper and high value recyclable plastic do the overall best job of generally getting you good carbon bang for your buck and being accepted in DC's recycling system. But it's hard to say, not on a case-by-case basis. One of the really great questions I got a week or so ago was about detergent containers, just as one microcosm of this trade-off, and whether someone ought to go for like a big HDPE heavy jug of laundry detergent or a like thin multi-laminate stand-up pouch that's super light. You know, same amount of liquid material being transported in both of them. But the multi-laminate package, the plastic film there isn't recyclable. It has to go in the trash because it's a mix of plastics and metal. It can't go to store drop off either. And that's so much less carbon. I tend to go in that stand-up pouch direction because it's like 90% less material and much lower carbon, even though it's not circular and recyclable. But that's one of the few instances I'll do that. For example, I was at Sweet Green the other day. They have aluminum water bottles. If looking at aluminum water bottles versus a PET soda bottle, we have great end markets for both PET and aluminum in DC. And for sure, theoretically, aluminum can be recycled infinitely. PET, much like paper, can only be recycled 5, 6, 7 times before the polymer chains get shorter and shorter, just like a piece of paper fiber getting shorter and shorter. But because we only recycle 25% of our waste today, I'm not so concerned with which is more recyclable than the other. To me, I think about they're both accepted, they're both high value material we earn revenue on, and the PET bottle has a lot lower carbon than the aluminum one. But it's hard. I empathize with everyone who's like standing at the shelf at a CVS trying to figure out what the best option is.
A lot of grocery store calculus.
Yeah, for sure.
So Anne had this question, and I'm interested in it because the two locations that she's talking about are right on the river, but she wanted to know, how do we stop Audi Field and Nat Stadium from selling plastic water bottles? They will not allow recyclable water bottles.
They will not allow recyclable water bottles. Well, certainly plastic bottles are accepted in DC's recycling system and high value, but I recognize the concern of the location being near waterways. We want to make extra sure in those locations that nothing is escaping the system. And obviously reusable is always better. So for sure, it would be exciting to see them encourage discounts for people bringing in their own containers. Without a doubt, I imagine that there's some good ways. I would say as a whole, one of the things that comes to mind for me is when I was helping companies, you know, like major consumer product good companies who are often, you know, they have money to invest when they figure out the right thing to do. And there's a lot of smart people working on it in their ranks that are trying to get buy-in from leadership. Consumer feedback is invaluable. I've been in so many meetings where someone has pulled up an email or a tweet or a Facebook message from a random person who bought their item and was ticked that it wasn't recyclable or wasn't recyclable enough. And that's been the leverage they've used to make major investments happen. So would super encourage reaching out to those stadiums. I guess I haven't been myself. I am not a sports gal, I'll admit. So I'm not sure what they might accept or not accept there. But definitely encouraging reuse. There are a couple great examples of stadiums and sports venues where they've been able to achieve 95% waste diversion at their events because they go really hard in the compostable packaging direction and ensure that 100% of everything can be composted. So they don't have a trash bin, a recycling bin, a composting bin. They really lean all the way into the organic side, and they do shut down people at the gate. They won't let you bring in plastic or metal or anything else, even if it's recyclable, because they have committed to a zero waste organic system. They've even worked with manufacturers to develop like compostable candy wrappers and peanut bags and chip bags to accommodate that. So whichever venue kind of resonates with you, would definitely recommend reaching out, and whether it's being allowed to bring in a reusable item container for you to use, or advocating that they use incentives for reusables or go compostable, a few strategies that comes to mind.
Yeah, and I know that Nats Stadium, in the short time that it's been on the river, I've noticed quite a difference in terms of the sustainability measures that they have taken, and they're, a LEED certified stadium. So I do think they're trying, but yeah, very, very helpful tips. Another question, are there any new AI development in sorting?
Yeah, lots. There are a slew of robotics and AI companies out there that are helping recycling facilities be more accurate in what they sort. There's two ways that they sort. They sort positively and negatively. So that means every time I see a PET bottle, I'm going to positively sort it out. And they usually have a big air jet that comes and like poofs it out to the side to go down the PET stream, or they negatively sort something out. So it might be something like metal isn't supposed to be in the secondary plastic sortation conveyor belt. So if they see metal, they'll negatively sort out metal and keep everything else. And there's lots of really interesting strategies to try and better recognize shape and color and branding to help recycling technology know that's recyclable. I would say that it's pretty early stages. And one of the unfortunate things is that a lot of recycling facilities don't even have the basic equipment and technologies that would be really useful just to go from good to great, let alone great to excellent. Most optical sorters. So when we sort materials at a recycling facility, we use different kinds of sortation mechanisms depending on the material. Something like, depending on whether it's non-ferrous metal or ferrous, you use magnets or what's called eddy currents that uses a magnetized field to get those materials out. For plastic, they use optical sorters. And that's especially where AI and machine learning, has come into play. Super encourage AMP robotics is a great one. But for instance, DC, we have optical sorters to sort out PET, colored HDPE, natural HDPE, and then polypropylene and polystyrene go together to a secondary sortation facility. Montgomery County, for instance, just got their first optical sorters. So they went from sorting all plastics together because they didn't have any technology to separate one kind from another, to starting to separate different kinds of plastics apart. And they cost, $300,000 a pop, maybe. It's hard to get the buy-in for technology like that in some of these really high capital cost facilities. So there's really exciting momentum, but it's like pulling teeth to get funding for it. But would encourage checking out Waste 360 and Waste Dive are two websites that cover a lot of those innovations and R&D developments. If you don't already check them out, that's a really good source to start.
So we're just at about time, and I just want to thank you so much for the time and the knowledge that you shared with us. There's a lot of comments of people thanking you for answering your questions so well. So a round of applause to you. And if you want to share where they can follow you on Twitter or other ways that they can stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, everyone, for your time and thoughts and excellent questions. I'm so bummed we couldn't get through all of them, but would love to talk online. I feel like I normally should say, like, we'll talk offline, but in our remote world, I'm just dropping my two handles here for Twitter and Instagram. Anytime you guys have questions, it is the most fun thing to do, to chat with folks online about whether or not something could be recycled or why something works this way and not the other. Would love to keep brainstorming together and learn about the ideas that you have. And hope this isn't the only time we're on, but thanks everyone so much for your time. And we'll be posting both on Twitter and Instagram in the near future, but I'm starting a newsletter as well for folks, mostly focused on DC local activity. So if you aren't super active on Instagram and Twitter, hope to stay in touch over email.
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining. We will do this again soon, and we will share resources that are available. So thanks again for your time, and enjoy the rest of your night, everyone.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, guys. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks so